All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Maru Gonzalez. I'm an assistant professor and youth development specialist at North Carolina State University.
My name is Christy Bird, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education and Learning Sciences at North Carolina State University.
Hi, and my name is Luke Sheely, and I am a senior undergrad student at North Carolina State University.
And we are so delighted to be here today to speak with you all about integrating storytelling and podcasting into 4-H programming. We believe deeply in the power of storytelling and in podcasts as an effective medium through which to tell stories. We also believe that when grounded in compassion, storytelling can nurture a strong sense of self-worth, cultivate critical consciousness, and drive collective action, especially among young people. So in that spirit, let's get started because we have quite an ambitious agenda today. So we're going to start off with a barometer activity, and then we'll talk a little bit about storytelling as pedagogy. We'll play a quick trivia game and then get into talking about podcasts, using podcasts as a platform for storytelling. And we'll look more closely at two podcasts. One called En Mis Zapatos, which is a podcast that was created by a 4-H youth here in North Carolina, as well as Pass the Mic Youth, which is a podcasting program through NC State Extension. And then at the end, we'll do a think share, and if we have time, we'll get to questions and answers.
Great, so to start things off, we have a short 2-question barometer activity just to get an idea of how everybody feels in the room about storytelling and how that relates to youth activism and youth civic engagement. So we have a quick poll here, and the first question that we have is it easy for the youth to change the minds of adults? And it also looks like that is what the second question is showing up, but the second question is actually, I believe that stories can change the world, is the second question. So we'd love to get everybody's response very quickly. I think it'd be interesting to see whether you agree with this statement, whether you disagree with this statement, or if you're not particularly sure. And if you have a source for your belief, we'd love for you to share it briefly in the chat as well. So both of these questions are questions that we try to approach and take a look at with hashtag Pass the Mic Youth, and we've certainly got varying degrees of response, certainly on the first question, both from young people and adults. And I'm not exactly sure how the poll is going to work, Maru. Are we able to see the results of that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I can see the results. So I just assumed that everybody else could. I can share the results with everyone. So, or I can end the poll. Maybe if I end the poll, then you'll be able to see the results. I'm an amateur at using Zoom polls, as you can tell. But I'll end the poll and see if maybe the results show up. And if not, then I'm happy to share them. Can everybody see that?
No.
Okay. All right, so for the first question, it's easy for youth to change the minds of adults. 24% of you all agreed, 24% weren't sure, and 53% disagreed. So the vast majority of folks disagreed for the first question. Oh, the results are visible now. Okay, wonderful. Well then, Luke, you can take it away.
Great, yeah, I think this is an interesting results that we have where half of us we actively disagree that it's easy for young people to change the mind of adults. Not necessarily that it's not possible, but we also all seem to have a consensus that stories can change the world, and probably particularly change the way that we all see the world as well. And so that's the thing that we want to get into next, is how stories can actually change our perception and the power that they hold.
So in this section, I'm going to talk about the power of storytelling. And we think that stories are even more important now in our current political climate. And we want to talk about what are the different kinds of storytelling and what makes stories powerful. So in this slide, it literally focuses on the ways that storytelling can build connections between people, help you establish mutual understanding between and across social identity groups. So even when people come from different backgrounds, by telling stories, you can find what are the similarities and what are the differences and develop that empathy. It can help you think about what in your life has been difficult for you and how have you overcome that? You can tell stories about resilience. You can tell stories to reduce prejudice and really learn about people who are different. It can help you nurture your self-worth and empowerment, and that's what we especially think is important for young people, to be able to learn about how they can be change agents in society and cultivate their critical consciousness, their understanding about society, and then drive action to actually change society. So in the poll, it says, it's about half of people believe that it's easy for adults to change the minds of youth. We think that stories make it easier for youth to do that. So I want to spend a little bit talking about dominant narratives. Some stories are more familiar to us than others. And dominant narratives are the stories that favor the interests of one group over another group. So these are the stories that you hear really often, and they just sound like they're correct, right? They just kind of flow off the tongue. They really are familiar to you. So some examples: if you work hard, you'll be successful. Things like protests are not as effective as political involvement. And the thing about these stories is they can feel very familiar, but you can also think of situations where these stories are not true. They may not be true in your experience or someone else's experience. They might actually be counter to your experience. So what we want to talk about in the rest of this is really say that everyone has a story to tell, whether or not it fits with those dominant narratives. And so on the next slide, we just have a couple quotes about storytelling. So this one says, storytelling can serve as a bicultural mirror, validating, supporting, and encouraging students during cognitive disequilibrium, thus helping them discover a language that accurately describes the feelings, ideas, and observations that previously have not fit into any of the definitions of experience provided by the dominant educational discourse. So what this is saying, that people can hear these dominant narratives in their classrooms, in their communities, and by offering a way for them to tell their story that may not fit with that dominant narrative, you're actually giving them a mirror for their own experience to validate that experience. And so a way of describing those other types of stories is the term counter narratives. So this is a definition by Solorzano and Yasso, which is a method of telling the stories of those people whose experiences are not often told. So we want to highlight counter narratives as a way to think about whose story has been left out of the dominant narrative. And then another quote to highlight this. You might have heard some versions of this idea, which is that until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So you can think about the hunters having the dominant narrative, the narrative that gets told most often, but the lions have their own story too, and they can tell a counter narrative that might reveal more nuance in the situation. So now we're gonna have you watch a video. And I wanna talk about some of the dominant narratives and the counter narratives that you hear in this video.
Verizon knows how to build unlimited right. Start with America's most awarded network. Give people more plans to mix and match at a price built for everyone. with $700 off our best phones when you switch. Because everyone deserves the best. This is unlimited built right.
Racism means basically like
a large part of a race feels that they're superior to another race. And so not only do they believe that, but they act on it.
Examples would be in class. Sometimes I'd be the only black kid, and we read a book like Huck Finn, and then there's that uncomfortable moment, the magic word come up, and people would look at you and you're like, what's his reaction, and things like that.
I was walking home from school with this one white girl, and we just gotten off the bus, and we were almost home, and there were these group of black kids that just gone out of school, and she was like, oh, let's cross the street, there's a group of black kids, I don't want to run into them. And so she told me, which I don't even know why she would do that.
I used to wear a sweatband, like, just to reinforce my wrist, and I had a teacher come up to me and say, you should take it off because it looks gang affiliated.
I've been in situations where, I had to cross the street because I didn't want to scare the white lady that was walking.
It would get to the point where I would start to count how many times a woman would clutch her bag.
When I was 16, I was leaving my mom's house in my pajamas, which had snowmen on them, with my brother, and we were actually stopped by the police rather aggressively. I've been stopped by the cops on my way between classes because we have two separate buildings, walking from one building to the other building, as my white students in the same class walk by me.
It's kind of upsetting because we live in a world where my mom has to be afraid when I walk outside from the people that are meant to protect me. And I don't like when my mother feels like that. I love my mother. I want her to always be happy.
I walk tall, I keep my head up, very, try to be very articulate and polite. And so, of course, I was like, okay, I'm going to be fine because I act a certain way. And of course, that has absolutely nothing to do with it. The way people perceive you, is not up to you. My parents taught me, cops are your friends, you're supposed to, they're here to protect you. But all I'm seeing is the opposite. So how can I not be afraid when I feel like I'm being hunted? When I feel like I'm there to fill a quota?
We are in a so-called free society. And as a black man, we literally don't feel free. We don't know what freedom is.
Every time we're killed, the first thing you see on the news is, criminal record. Or something like that. So from the second the bullet hits us, already we're starting to be dehumanized.
With black people like myself, we don't get as many chances as they do. So you have to be aware and you have to watch out and you can't mess up.
This was an extremely emotionally taxing process for me in terms of coming to terms with maybe the nature of racism in my own life and in this country and in this world. And if you wait until somebody is 12, 13, and 14 to put that on them, it can be really difficult.
My dad, he's just like the honest one. He's like, listen, son, like there are things in this world, like you kind of have to watch out. He doesn't want me to live in fear, but he wants me to be aware.
I want people to know that I'm perfectly fine and I'm not gonna hurt anybody or do anything bad. I should be judged about like who I am and like and what kind of person I am.
My parents would tell me, especially my mom, she would tell me, you have to endure, you have to muscle through it. And this is no different. It's a part of being a person of color in America.
And there's a certain comfortability associated with that because if I know that something is inevitable, then I know how to deal with it. Fortunately, I've had parents who have said, this is what you do.
Mom and Dad, I'll be fine because you did a good job raising me. You gave me all the resources and the time, the blood, sweat, and tears to make me a good man, an honorable man, and the foundation to survive in this country.
I want you to know that I will act in an appropriate manner and do everything that you told me to do because I do love you, and I know that everything you say is not for a reason and not just to talk, and I love you.
So we want to spend a few minutes getting your reactions. So what about the stories that you heard stood out to you? And in what ways did they change your perspective? And you can share in the chat. And let's just spend a few minutes responding to the stories here. What were some of the dominant narratives? What were the counter narratives? How did they affect you? And so we've got people thinking about how the parents are fearful and having to feel like they have to talk to their children about what to expect. Someone's impacted by the tone of the kids' voices. Yeah, it's really impressive how they're so young and they're trying to be strong. Yeah, and how the students are really wanting to comfort their parents even. Some of them were soft-spoken, but really eager. And I think that's something that you'll find with a lot of youth is that even though they might be nervous or they might not necessarily have the most bold voice, they want to have their voice out there. Yeah, about the 10-year-old boy having to tell people that he won't hurt you. And then the questions about how can we change the narrative, right? How can they help people feel more comfortable? And how can we as adults help those kids be in environments where they can feel safe and comfortable? And this last comment here, they feel like they have to tiptoe around others due to stereotypes. So my research looks at adolescents, middle and high school students, and they are very aware of the stereotypes that people have about people like them, about their race and about their gender. And that can affect how they move in their schools and how they want to present themselves because they want to make sure that they are seen for who they really are and they want to be successful. But sometimes the environments we have as adults, the stories we tell about them as adults can impact that. Yeah, and then this idea about the parents are preparing them to address the racism that they experience. And as adults, even if you're not their parent or even if you're not the organizer of their program, you can have an impact on youth and help them to face the things that they might see in the world. Thank you all for those comments. It's really great to hear your thinking.
So now we have some trivia about some of the stories that maybe we don't tell that much. So we have 3 different questions about 3 different activists that don't really get that much attention. And so we invite you to, if you know the answer to this question, please list it in the chat and you will win a grand prize of not really anything. But anybody knows who, before Rosa Parks, as a 15-year-old was arrested after refusing to give up their seat to a white woman on a segregated bus. We'll do like 5 more seconds of that if anybody knows the answer. Yes, awesome. Yep, it is Claudette Colvin, who 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus and was jailed for it, but eventually bailed out by her pastor. But the civil rights movement did not want to really publicize her specific case, and because as a 15-year-old, she was pregnant at the time, and that was not the narrative that they were hoping to push out. So our next activist that we would like to highlight is there's actually 2 answers for this one. So during Nazi Germany, this nonviolent student-led resistance group conducted an anonymous leaflet and graffiti campaign that called for active opposition to the Nazi regime. As a result, many were charged with treason and sentenced to death. So if you know the name of either one of the activists or the group, yes, the White Rose is the group. And the two of the most prominent activists from this group were a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. And their group passed out many leaflets and anti-propaganda pieces describing what the Nazi Party was doing, but were eventually both, Sophie Scholl was eventually executed by guillotine for her actions at the age of 21. The last trivia question that we have is again going back to the civil rights movement, and this person is best known as the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. This openly gay civil rights leader was instrumental in shaping Dr. King's nonviolent philosophy. Maybe do like 10 more seconds on this one, if anybody knows the answer. And this was Bayard Rustin, who, despite all of these achievements and the important work that he was doing, he was silenced and threatened and imprisoned and fired from important positions of leadership, largely because he was an openly gay man in a time of fierce homophobia. So we invite you all to keep these three different activists in mind, and you're thinking of what stories do we tell, what sorts of change makers do we talk about, and also what change makers do we not talk about and why.
So when we think about narratives, I think it's also important to think about what narratives we hear about young people and what narratives we share about young people. It's important to point out that throughout modern history, young people have played an integral role in advancing the needle on civil rights. And yet, despite their many contributions, they're often regarded as either indifferent and apathetic on the one hand, or sort of idealistic, overly idealistic and sort of radical on the other hand. And we think at Pass the Mic Youth, one of the reasons we created this podcast is because we think it's important to change this narrative that's often told about young people. And that's one of the reasons that we created the podcast, because we think it's important to amplify the voices and the experiences of young people and really shine a light on youth activism. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Before we do, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on laying the groundwork, because in order to share counter narratives and personal narratives, some work needs to be done on the front end to lay the foundation for having positive, productive, and often challenging conversations. So first, I think that has to start with establishing community intentions. And what this is essentially asking young people what needs to exist within a group, within this group specifically, before engaging in dialogue that is both honest and respectful. And they may come up with ideas like sharing airtime, giving everyone an opportunity to share their experience. It might include things like taking steps to ensure confidentiality. And one of the biggest things too is promoting a culture of active listening and really teaching active listening. And there are a variety of exercises and activities online that allow young people to practice what active listening looks like. But when telling a story, especially if it's a personal story, it's really important for that person who's sharing their story to feel listened to. And so active listening is really an integral part of creating that space where people feel like they can share and they can be vulnerable. And another aspect that is important is to emphasize dialogue. So if you can, just take a moment and use the chat box and describe the difference between dialogue and debate. Because we often do, we tend to sort of emphasize debate over dialogue. So I'm saying dialogue is agreeing to disagree. Dialogue involves listening to understand. Debate is more listening to respond. Absolutely. Yeah, when you're engaging in dialogue, the goal is really to understand the other person's perspective. Whereas debate, you're trying to respond. You may not even be listening to what the other person has to say. You're just sort of thinking about what you're going to say in response to them. Dialogue is an open discussion where your mind is open to change, absolutely, whereas debate is really about trying to prove your point. It's more thoughtful, it's about listening, whereas debate is more about winning. Yeah, absolutely. And it can be challenging because we do live in a debate-centric culture, and especially now where things seem to be so polarized, it's important to emphasize the importance of dialogue and of listening to learn and to understand, not necessarily to agree, but just getting to a place of mutual understanding. And I think this figure does a good job of describing the difference between debate, which is at the bottom of the pyramid, and it's really about me, it's about winning. And as you move further up along the pyramid, you get to a place of we, of learning, of understanding, of shared purpose. And that's really at the core of storytelling. And I think one of the things that's so powerful about storytelling is the way that it can connect people. Because even if we haven't had the same experiences, and of course we haven't had the same experiences, we can all connect to the same human experience, which is, those feelings of joy and sadness and grief and triumph, those universal human emotions that we've all experienced and that are really embedded throughout each of our stories. And the more intentional we are about creating these spaces, the more willing young people are going to be to push the edges of their comfort zone and get to a place where the magic happens, where that growth takes place. And that's really a place that we want to be.
So in my role working with Christy and Maru, one of my favorite things that I get to do is work with hashtag Pass the Mic Youth, and mainly in a production role of actually putting the podcast together. And podcasts offer a space where you can more or less explore many of the things that young people are interested in, and they can be listened to at any point in time. And I think something unique about podcasts is because there isn't a visual element like with video or something, that you're really focusing on the substance of what is being said. And so the story really takes center stage, and the discussion takes center stage. And that leads to, I think, the experience of the young person that we are sharing the story of being able to maybe be a little bit better understood, because the listener is just paying attention to the words and to what the young person is saying, and they're able to share their experience and maybe change the perception of the listener. So besides hashtag Pass the Mic Youth, we'd also want to share another podcast with you that is in the works, and it is produced and created by Guillermo Estrada, who is the NC 4-H Southeast District President, and it's called En Mis Zapatos, which is Spanish for In My Shoes. and we have a short trailer for the podcast here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Guillermo Estrada, and I'm super excited to talk to you about my podcast, En Mis Zapatos, a mission to highlight the hard work of the Latinx community in North Carolina. So, I'd first like to start off with a little introduction about myself. So, my name is Guillermo Estrada, once again, and I'm the North Carolina 4-H Southeast District President. And I'm also, again, the host of the En Mis Zapatos podcast, as well as the president of my county council in Wayne County, North Carolina. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea and how the whole process of En Mis Zapatos began. So the idea came to me while we were working and participating in the virtual conferences for North Carolina 4-H Citizenship Focus and Juntos Academy. And we had listened to all these amazing presenters, including Pass the Mic Youth, and I really liked their idea and their whole mission about making sure that youth activism is recognized in the United States. But I want to bring that lens in a little bit closer to home in North Carolina and highlight the Latinx community, the community I know best. So the process in creating this podcast is very hard, especially for beginners, but once you get into it, you really start to realize how easy it is. So every time I go somewhere, especially when I'm recording ambient sound and stuff like that, I take my point and shoot microphone and I'll interview all these amazing people. So right here you can see one of the young ladies I interviewed at the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and seeing all these children that we're helping out really made an impact on me, seeing that there are Latinx children making a difference in their community. And that's why this podcast is so important, because these children that I interviewed could create an impact on another child who really needs that role model to start helping others. They're giving out over 100 meals, summer meals to children every single day. And that's what I think 4-H is about, finding role models, which brings us to 4-H and En Mis Zapatos. 4-H to me means making an impact anywhere you can, no matter if it's just your club, your community, your country, or your world. And that is what I'm hoping En Mis Zapatos does for other young children, teens, adults, young and old, with this podcast. I'm hoping that they can find someone that they relate to, someone that they can see themselves in, someone that they can see themselves in their shoes. And that's the goal of this podcast, as well as making sure that Latinx achievements are highlighted and honored. So now I'm going to play a quick episode snippet of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee episode, and I hope you guys like it, and here it goes. Now I'm going to ask you a really deep question. Are you proud of yourself?
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
So tell me, why are you proud of yourself? What are some things that just make you in awe of yourself?
Well, I'm proud of myself because if you look into it, teenagers my age right now, they're out there doing stuff like smoking and drinking, all that. And then I look at myself and I'm like, wow, I'm really different because I'm out here helping people that need it. And I'm a really good, inspiring person, I say for myself. And
I like to think of it as changing the narrative, because the narrative around Latino people can be really negative at times. That was Shaylee from Wayne County, North Carolina. I really hope you enjoyed that snippet, and if you'd like to listen to the future episodes that will come out in the next couple of months and listen to the trailer that's already out, please subscribe to En Mis Zapatos anywhere where you get your podcasts, including Apple Music, Spotify, Google Podcasts, anywhere. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions or you want to learn more about En Mis Zapatos, please follow at En Mis Zapatos NC on Instagram and Facebook. And feel free to email me at any time at guillermoe2304@gmail.com. Thank you so much again for your time today. And thank you to Dr. Maru Gonzalez for allowing me to participate in this amazing webinar. Thank you, guys.
We truly appreciate Guillermo spending the time to create this presentation to share with everybody about the work that he is doing in North Carolina. We are excited to continue working with him and to partner with him in the future as well and see how his project grows. So now I'd like to move to our other podcast that we want to examine a little bit. It's called #Pass the Mic Youth. And this is the project that the three of us are directly involved in. And the goal of this project is to amplify young voices and young activists through their experiences and by sharing their stories with other people through a podcast and a blog. And we have a very wide range of young people that we talk to. In each episode, we seek to create a narrative experience for the listener to really get into why this young person is doing the work that they are. What does it look like for them on a daily basis? What challenges have they experienced? What successes have they had? And most importantly, what have they learned along the way in the work that they've done? We also have submissions with #Pass the Mic Youth, where we invite young people to contribute to our blog, and we've had some incredible contributions about perspectives that young people hold, work that they are doing in their own communities, and also we've had quite a bit of art and poetry submitted to us about their life experience that they want to share with the world, which can be another extremely powerful form of storytelling. So this is a picture of our team. Besides the three of us that you see here today at the webinar, we also have Nuera Nyota and Mateen Ma'ani, who work on the podcast. It's the three NC State students that work on actually producing the podcasts, interviewing the young people, working on blog posting, creating blog posts, and working with young people to share their voices, to amplify their voices, and to share their stories with the world. So we'd also like to share some of these stories that we've had the opportunity to listen to and to curate and share that with you today.
Some people were like saying, oh my God, Puerto Rican protest looks like a carnival, like a party. And yes, in a way, because we're very happy people, but there was like a sense of solidarity I've never seen before.
Hi everyone, welcome to #Pass the Mic Youth, where we work to amplify the voices of hardworking young activists around the world. I'm Nuera Nyota.
I'm Mateen Ma'ani.
And I'm Luke Sheely. We strive to share stories and experiences. These are just a few of the determined young voices you'll hear on our episodes.
Not all the responses I've gotten have been exactly loving or supportive. There's always going to be those people who don't like what I'm doing.
There's sort of this idea of like faces of activism, voices of activism, in which faces and voices come to represent entire movements, which is very destructive because movements are made to speak for communities.
Whenever there is a decision to be made, it's a group decision. So it is directly connected to every single person's choice.
Like it was all paying off in that like one event, and I was like kind of scared out of my mind, but also like super excited for what the future held.
Young people have always been on the forefront of change. #Pass the Mic Youth explore the challenges they've faced, the successes they've had, and what they've learned along the way.
Listen everywhere you find podcasts.
So yes, that's
all right.
Go ahead, Maru.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I'm gonna say that was a quick sample of a few of the voices that we have on #Pass the Mic Youth, and we all really value the experience that young people can add and can bring to the world. And so we believe that it's important to share these stories with each other and to share these stories with other young people.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you can use hashtag Pass the Mic in your program. So first and foremost, we have, as Luke was saying, we have podcasts and we have blog posts. And so one of the things that we seek to do with our podcasts and blog posts is to use the content and the experiences shared by young people to generate dialogue. And so I can take you to our website now, just so that you can get a little bit more familiarity. So this is an example of a blog post which corresponds to a podcast episode by the same name. And at the end of the blog post, you'll see questions for extended dialogue. And so the idea is to listen to all or part of an episode and then have a conversation with young people about what they heard. We have a listen now link as well, which takes you directly to various platforms that you can click on to access all of our podcast episodes. So this is our latest one called Civic Engagement for the Future. And then in addition to that, you can also find, we have blog post focused discussion questions and podcast focused discussion questions. And so we try to catalog all of the questions for extended dialogue associated with each blog post episode here. So there are all sorts of ways to use the content, whether it be through the blogs or through the podcast episodes, to generate dialogue about a variety of different ongoing social issues. We also have resources, which we've curated. And my apologies for the slow internet. So here under critical curriculum and resources, we curated a sort of like a database of different resources on issues ranging from disability justice to racial identity and anti-racism to youth leadership. So if you click, for example, on media literacy, there are different lessons that we've hand selected related to media literacy, which takes the work out for you. And the purpose of this is really to develop youth critical consciousness, which includes fostering critical reflection, cultivating political efficacy so that young people can engage in informed critical action. And I also wanted to mention that we have a curriculum which will hopefully be coming out soon. We already finished the first draft. And then another way to use Pass the Mic Youth in your program is, Luke was talking about submissions. And so we encourage young people to submit their, either a podcast or a blog post idea or a completed blog post. If there's a submissions tab on our website, and they just have to click on this form. So they can submit a blog post, they can submit original music, they can submit poetry, all sorts of things. And as Luke mentioned, we also have had a couple of art activism challenges. Our most recent one was related to Juneteenth, and we put out a call for pieces related to liberation and resistance and resilience, and we got some really beautiful art pieces. Actually, that's not the, let me go to the right link. Yeah, we got a lot of really beautiful art pieces as a result of that. This isn't the comprehensive, all of the submissions, but we got some great pieces from that as well. And then finally, we have under the hashtag Pass the Mic Youth Educator Toolbox, we have a lesson on celebrating youth voices. And so this is a lesson that you can use to help young people develop their own stories and perform the stories to, to their group of peers or in the community. And so that's another way that that you can integrate and use Pass the Mic Youth in your programs. And of course, those who feel comfortable are encouraged to submit their pieces to Pass the Mic Youth. And there's in the submission form, if they're under 18, they are required, of course, to get parental permission. So apparently my internet is reconnecting. So my apologies for that. Okay, so it looks like I'm back. So we wanted to end by asking what are some ways that you can integrate storytelling and podcasting into your work and into your programs, and what steps you can take to incorporate the voices, histories, and stories of marginalized people in your program. So if you can use the chat box, that would be great. And then at the end of this presentation, Luke is going to share some really great resources that you can use if you're interested in working with young people to start a podcast. So I see a question. So we'll get to questions at the end. But right now, if you all have any thoughts related to some of the ways that you can integrate storytelling and podcasting into your work, and any steps that you can take to more intentionally incorporate the stories and histories of marginalized people in your podcast. So here it says, we are currently planning a 4-H podcast with our Minnesota 4-H state ambassadors. It will be used to talk about a variety of things 4-H. The youth plan to interview staff, interview other youth. All of these will be a variety of topics and stories and highlight different opportunities in 4-H on both the state and the national level. That's really exciting. And I don't know that we included this in our list of resources, but there's also a really great resource. I'm not sure if you all have heard about it, but it's called the Learning Network, and it's under the New York Times. And they have a great resource about how to integrate podcasts into the classroom. And even though it's education specifically, it can easily be translated to a 4-H environment as well. And they also have like a bunch of writing prompts. So they have something, an article called Over 1,000 Writing Prompts, just to get young people thinking about a story that they might want to tell. So there are all sorts of really great resources out there to help get you started. So Crystal says, I plan to engage dialogue with my teen council members to discuss ways to bring storytelling to the limelight. I'm not sure of the platform yet. That's awesome. I created a summer activity with food exploration and learning about members' own and others' heritages through food and music. I incorporated storytelling from their families in that activity. So I wanted to explore how to expand upon that and using podcasts to share those stories, recipes, and family culture. That's wonderful. Cool. So you all have a lot of great ideas and some initiatives that are already happening and some that are in the works. And Allison said we could weave it into some of our existing teen programs as a project choice. We also have an organization called the Vermont folk life center that we might be able to partner with. They do a lot of work to record the stories of Vermonters. Maybe 4-Hers could help collect stories from the community for them. Yeah, podcasting is a really great way to learn more about your community. I think Guillermo's work in Mis Zapatos does a great job of highlighting that. He's had the opportunity to interview and get to know a lot of Latinx people in his community through that podcast and share those stories with others, which is exciting. And podcasting doesn't have to be difficult. I think a lot of people are afraid of starting their own podcast, especially those of us like myself who may be less tech savvy. But really you can record interviews on an iPhone, and then it's just a matter of editing them and putting them together. And of course that takes practice, and I think that's something that Luke can definitely speak to. But it doesn't have to be too challenging to start a podcast. And as I'm sure all of us know, young people are incredibly tech savvy, certainly more than I am.
Great. So I'm happy to speak briefly about a few different resources that are possible out there. And certainly, as Maroon mentioned, one of the advantages of podcasting is that they can be like pretty much free, completely free to create, to share with others, and are not all that complex to make. You can actually do it completely entirely on a single smartphone. This first resource, or actually the first two resources I'll talk about together. The first is the NPR podcast curriculum guide of how to bring podcasting to a classroom or to an organization that is youth serving, and goes through some great steps of different tools that you can use in different ways to introduce starting a podcast and talking about how to share the stories of your community through a podcast. And the second link here is Buzzsprout's How to Start a Podcast guide that offers a very extensive view of all the steps needed to one, create a podcast and put it together, but also to share it with the world and be able to share it with other people. And that may be more of an advanced guide and may be more helpful for a facilitator to read through before starting a podcast with young people. This third resource here is an excellent curated list of podcasts and apps and websites for students to use. They review lots of apps and resources such as GarageBand, where you may be able to create a podcast in, as well as different podcasting apps and different podcasts. That's a great way to learn about new resources or see some uses for resources that you already know about. And of course, we also want to offer ourselves as a resource. If you have any questions about podcasting or the work that we do after this seminar, we are completely happy to talk to you and answer any of those questions. And our email is passthemicyouth@ncsu.edu.
All right, and one last thing before we get to questions. We're also on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook under Pass the Mic Youth. And the website is passthemicyouth.com or passthemicyouth.ncsu.edu, but passthemicyouth.com is easier to remember. And the podcast is available wherever you can find podcasts. So with that said, any questions?
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions, but I do want to tell you that you can email us. It's a way to get to all of us on the team. So if you email passthemicyouth@ncsu.edu, you can just say, hey, this message is from Rue or Christy or Luke, and we'll get it to the right person. So if you do have questions, you can ask us in the chat. And Maru, there was a question about extension and approval, so you probably want to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, the first thing we did was we set up a portal through extension so that we had our own website where we could house all of the podcast episodes and blog posts and things like that. And then in terms of approval, really the only hurdle was making sure that since we were collecting the stories of young people, that that we had consent. And that was, once we sort of got over that, that was the biggest thing. We also, you know, I guess you can't have comments on NCSU like blog posts, but you know, but just making sure that you know, if we posted something, you know, we would disable comments, for example, just to make sure that, you know, there aren't any trolls writing mean comments or anything like that. And another thing that we were really intentional about doing was acknowledging the young people who contributed with Pass the Mic Youth swag. So any young person who submits a piece and that piece is featured, they'll be sent, you know, like a tote bag and a pen and things like that. Because it's important, I think, to acknowledge the work of young people. Often, you know, we say we appreciate the work of young people, but we don't compensate or acknowledge it in any way. And so that was something that we wanted to be intentional about. But the biggest thing is just, you know, as you know, with all, you know, whenever you work with young people, it's making sure their privacy is protected, that there's consent if they're sharing a story, that kind of thing. How often do you release new episodes? Luke, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I answered it in the chat. We release episodes every 2 weeks. And sometimes that is closer to 3 weeks.
Yeah. And did we have to obtain IRB approval to obtain the stories? No, because we're not using them for research purposes. So if we changed our minds and said we want to use these stories to, you know, for research purposes, then we would have to go through IRB. But we didn't have to do that because we haven't used their stories for research purposes. Anything else? Let's see, we have 3 minutes left. And of course, if you all, you know, are in the process of starting a podcast and have questions, feel free to reach out to us. All right, so I think that's it. Okay, we have one last question. Do you have team participants, members, edit, splice, etc. the podcast? So Luke, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I serve as our primary editor of the podcast in terms of actually like putting these different stories together. And I think our podcast is a little bit complex in its style because we also have sometimes like extra sources, like extra sound, extra music, and I definitely don't think that is something that is needed for a podcast. And so there's several different free pieces of software that you can use. Like if you have a iOS device, you have GarageBand for free, and if you have a non-iOS, like if you have a Windows computer, there is a program called Audacity that is completely free, and it's relatively easy to learn, and the resources that we mentioned before have some great short tutorial videos about how to use both of those free sources.
And I do want to add that Maru and I, we did not have any podcasting experience going into this. So as the faculty directors, we are collaborating with the students, and the students are the one who bring the expertise around the technology. So I think it's a really wonderful example of how you can draw on the strengths of the people who are around you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to add to that, the students are really the ones who come up with the ideas and who recruit participants and put together the podcast. So it really is youth-led and youth-centered. We're there to help facilitate and you know, and provide guidance and feedback as needed, but the ones who are really driving the podcast are the students. And so there's one more question. Do you have a targeted length of time for each podcast? Maybe Luke, you can answer that again. I'm happy to answer that, but you're the one with the expertise.
Yeah, so we try to keep each episode like around 20 to 30 minutes in length. I previously worked on a podcast that was maybe like 30 to 40 minutes in length and ended up doing like a short classroom lesson with it. And I asked for feedback on all the episodes. And one of the pieces of feedback was that some of the students thought the episodes a little bit long sometimes. And I think 20 to 30 minutes is sometimes like a good commute time for people as well. And so I think it's not any sort of requirement to keep it in that time. I think Guillermo's podcast is a little bit longer. I think he mentioned it was like around 40 minutes or so. So it could also be much shorter too, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. That's they're very open-ended.
Yeah, and certainly if you want to sort of, if you're trying out podcasts with young people, then it might make more sense to start out on the shorter end and then work your way up. But I think that's all we have time for. It's 2:01, so we can go ahead and end there. But we're really excited that you all came today and that you all are thinking about integrating storytelling and podcasting into your programs. And like we said before, if you have any questions or need resources, feel free to send us an email at passthemicyouth@ncsu.edu. And that's it.